So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to facilitate this panel. It's on Git and version control in the enterprise. I'm going to ask my panel to introduce themselves and maybe also tell me a bit about how they were first introduced to Git and what their reaction was. I'll go first. So I'm CB. I've already been introduced. And my first introduction was when a colleague over a decade ago said, have you heard about this new version control system that Linus Torvalds is writing? I said, no, I haven't actually. What is it? He said, well, it's kind of distributed, so like everybody has like their own copy of the repository, and like anybody can kind of like make a new version. And I said, well, hold on a moment. That doesn't make any sense. The whole point of a version control system is so that everybody knows what the single point of truth is and what the latest version is. Needless to say, since then, I've kind of learned a lot and changed my mind a lot. So let me start with you, Erik, and introduce yourself. And
yeah, for sure. First, CB, thanks for moderating this and having the three companies on stage. I'm not aware that has happened before, at least not in sort of a long-form setting with an actual discussion. Long overdue, I think. So that's awesome. I'm Erik van Zijst. I'm with Atlassian. I work on Bitbucket, engineer. And my story is kind of similar to yours. I had a friend who, I think about 2006, maybe late 2006, something like that, really early on, introduced me to, he said, there's this thing, it's Git, it's a new version control system. We were on Subversion at the time, and it seemed to work fine. I didn't really see the problem. We came from CVS, so it was a lot better. And I remember I looked at it because I had to, because it was the thing, and Torvalds, and I didn't really get it. I didn't really understand the fuzz, and it wasn't until like maybe 2 years later or so when I started using GitHub and I was sort of forced to use it because now GitHub was the thing that it really clicked, and at that point it's like, oh, this makes so much sense.
Right on.
So thanks.
I'm Briana Swift. I'm a GitHub trainer. So I spend a lot of time talking about Git and GitHub. So I love Git Merge. Y'all are my people here. My first experience with Git was just typing stuff into a black box because the internet told me to. And I did not understand it for a very, very long time. Once I really royally screwed up, that's when I first started to like, oh, this is why people want version control. And yeah, obviously, been using it ever since.
I'm James Ramsay. I'm product manager at GitLab, working on the Git bits of GitLab. I think is the easiest way to summarize it. My first experience of Git was when I was using CVS in 2008, and it ate my data without me realizing. And so then I started exploring other alternatives. And I think back then we were self-hosting our own Git server. I think back then I was still trying to wrap my head around all the distributed aspects, having come from centralized sort of version control. But then GitHub also sort of taught me how it actually worked. Yeah. And thankfully, now I get to work on it full time.
Awesome, awesome. So I think it's almost coincidence. It's like a common theme of like, what is this decentralized part to it and this distributed nature? And I kind of think when you look at most enterprises are very much around centralization. When the typical version control tool before enterprises started using Git was kind of like, yes, here is our global central repository. Here is where we keep our code. It's central, it's safe, secure. Everybody comes to the central truth. How is it that Git has been so widely adopted in enterprises when you'd think kind of just naively that it's not actually that suitable a tool for that sort of environment? So should we, carry on going in this order for a while, and then yep. Kind of butt in any order as you see fit, and then I can use my moderating hat.
Yeah, I can start. I don't know, really. Like it is a little weird that in some ways that a tool that not only sort of was designed for a fairly specific task in open source, this one repo and a very specific workflow, that amongst a sea of SCM tools, like there were no other SCM tools. There were professional tools, there were good tools, that Also, it had a terrible UI, let's be honest, especially
Still
early on.
does.
It still does. But now they're Stack Overflow and Google everything, but 10 years ago it was different. That would make it into sort of the de facto SCM, not just for open source, but everywhere. And so I'm not quite sure. Like on the one hand, there's the technical merits. Like it's very fast to use. The branching model is good. Like it's substantially better than Subversion and CVS before it, and so there are technical reasons to choose it. But still, I mean, there are other alternatives, and slowly but surely, well, not even slowly, Git sort of has taken over. So, not entirely sure. I think again, I think GitHub probably had a lot to do with it, in pull requests sort of making collaboration easier for the more average person.
Yeah, I really agree. I think that version control, especially at a Git conference, we think so much about the really, really detailed, zoomed-in view. And from my experience when I'm working with developers new to Git, that's really not where their head's at. They're like some of the talks earlier, just how do I do my job? How do I get through today with Git? And that's the collaboration. Whether it's distributed or not, whether they're using it as it's distributed or not, is, in my view, secondary. It gives them a way to work together in a new and better way.
Yeah, I think the collaboration around forking and open source communities is a really big factor in, I guess forking is not necessarily a Git feature, but all the major hosts support that model now. Is a really great way to collaborate. And then the code review tools, the collaboration, I think that's where a lot of the investment is happening, particularly around the repositories, is we're trying to build better code review tools and improve the collaboration so that people are building applications and software that can last decades. It's not just about pushing your code, it's about developing an application that you can get to customers. And I think the tooling around Git makes that really easy.
So, I mean, it's kind of, just to summarize, it's kind of like, it's almost by surprise that Git's so widely adopted kind of in the enterprise. And kind of thinking of situations I've come across, I think a lot of it's kind of been sort of from the ground up. So you sometimes get kind of like teams going, our existing processes are slowing us down. Let's just do a little Git thing. And then it becomes popular enough, it becomes kind of trendy, and people want to adopt it. So I wonder about typical kind of use cases and users in the enterprise. How do their needs differ from kind of like open source users? What's the what are the kind of challenges for Git? How do people have to use it differently? And I guess are these tools that we've built on top of Git kind of addressing that gap?
I think
I made that one question too difficult.
I think there are significant differences in how open source projects use Git to large enterprises. Particularly open source projects are using a forking model where everyone's got a distributed copy of the repository and then are sharing it back with each other. Whereas most large enterprise customers have one repository or a couple of big repositories and make use of a branching model. So the kinds of access controls they need are quite different. Developers are often empowered to merge things quite easily and quickly, whereas in an open source community there's a pretty small ring of maintainers and only those have write access. It varies by organization, of course. Like some big enterprises are really strict and will have much stricter controls than an open source project. So I think those controls that sit around the repo are really quite different for those large enterprises.
Yeah, I would agree. I think not only like the controls and the access and the permissions, but what other software is a developer allowed to use? If it's open source on my personal computer, I can do any text editor, any whatever I want. But then I go to work, and maybe I have a laptop that is provided to me that I cannot download anything new. And I'm really given a set of tools. And maybe the use of Git isn't necessarily different, but from the surface, when you're looking at it, it might look like a completely different workflow.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think there's that much to add, but like the biggest thing I think is stricter controls, or at least different kinds of controls, with a typical branching workflow at the center of it, and so therefore you've got a permission model not just as the gatekeeper towards a repository, but on individual branches or even certain operations on a branch, whether you can rebase or which branch you can rebase on, who can do that, whether or not changes can go in, without a pull request, or if they have to go through a pull request, like what kind of requirements there are before a pull request can be merged. There's a lot of kind of stuff that in a typical open source project, or at least sort of the more established ones that use mailing lists and patches still, that's quite different.
Yeah, that's very different. So I've really enjoyed a lot of the talks that you've had earlier today, and especially some of the talks about kind of scale and how we have incredibly large repositories, and kind of thinking about it, are these enterprise features the ability to handle kind of huge repositories? Now, I know kind of technically Android is open source, and therefore it's like a bit of an exception, but it is kind of driven fairly heavily by an enterprise, if you like. So I was kind of thinking, repository granularity, monorepo, is it here to stay? Does it make open source sense for open source, or is it the killer enterprise feature?
We only have 19 minutes.
Oh, OK. The short story.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a really difficult one. Like monorepos are Johan had a really good talk on it this morning.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
Yeah, and even he sort of, after looking at the research and whatever, sort of concluded that I don't know, like both work, I suppose. And I guess there's evidence of that, right? There are people that it divides a little bit, right? There's people that really believe in like a monorepo for those kinds of enterprises really is the way to go, and breaking it down into smaller repos really isn't. And there's people that argue the other way around. I don't know if I'm necessarily in the best position to be the judge of that. I do not work on a monorepo. We do not have like what you would call a monorepo. But it's obviously something that we're interested in because it's not necessarily about us. It's about whether or not the industry as a whole ultimately moves towards a broader acceptance of monorepos. And I think at this point, I can't speak for the other sites, but we don't see a lot of demand for that kind of scale. And sure, Google and Facebook and all that are doing it, and they have. They fight quite an uphill battle, but they're winning that battle, I guess, because there's a lot of things that have been changed in Git and Mercurial also that make it better now than it was before. But at this point, I think we don't really see a lot of need for it, or at least demand for it. So yeah, I don't know.
I mean, we see the request for large repositories pretty frequently. It is a small minority of organizations that have truly large repositories in the scale of Chromium or Android or even bigger. And they're often migrating from systems that are not Git. So they're trying to enter Git. They may have already migrated all their other projects to Git, and there's one last holdout in some other version control system. But a lot of the discussion around monorepos, is really around the ergonomics of dealing with lots of repos, not necessarily the scaling problem. And sometimes those two problems can be conflated. Git's making a lot of progress in supporting larger and larger repos more and more effectively. But yeah, I think there's also a parallel set of tooling that is solving some of those different problems around managing lots of services that are maybe all hosted in the same repository. But those kind of repositories can be much, much smaller than, say, the Linux repository even, which was the smallest example of a large repo shown this morning. So I think either works.
Yes. So
I think monorepos today, that's like the hot topic, right? I mean, we can talk about it for hours. But I think what I find really interesting is that they're a really great example of whether it's monorepos or the next thing, that Git can do it really well either way.
Yeah.
But still, there's this hunger, I feel enterprise customers just want you to tell them what to do. Just tell me which is the right way, whether it's going to be a monorepo or break it up, just tell me. And it's that's not the only time that conversation happens with Git. There's a lot of situations. So you can rebase. Yeah, they both work, Well,
that does bring up a good point, right? Like as you said, a lot of our customers, I think, ultimately are looking up to the vendor to see, like, I don't know, like, you guys must know, like, of anyone, like, what should we be using? And I think that is I think that's a bit of a requirement, I guess, for us to not just provide a whole bunch of tools, but also guide people into the right sort of workflow, and not just workflow, but also, like set sort of guidance or whatever towards whether or not you should organize your repos in such a way or such a way, right? Like bundle a lot of stuff into a, what do you want to call it, a monorepo or not, or go the opposite direction. And I don't really know. Like I'm sort of split on this at this point.
I mean, there's a space for guidance, but then there's also a space for every customer is going to have their own demands, and as much as a vendor is going to provide guidance that we think this works well, like say monorepo works well because you don't need to deal with merge requests in 20 different places. There's going to be a significant number of customers that just sort of say, no, like we've decided that we like to work in this other way, and whether or not you recommend that, we have done this for 10 years and we will continue to do so. So you kind of, as a vendor, we have to support both.
So the other sort of side of or there are multiple sides of the monorepo conversation. Maybe it's a dodecahedron or something. But one of the things that cropped up in my thoughts today, listening to talks, is that I have a rule of thumb, and you can agree or disagree with it, that the repository granularity kind of makes sense at a unit of release, whatever that means for your particular code base or something. So if you're releasing something, then a repository that's that size, and you're not releasing just part of a repository, or again, you're not kind of bundling up a whole lot of repositories always together all at the same time. That kind of makes sense as a rule of thumb. But there are obviously other constraints. And one of the things that kind of struck me was, do we lack good tools for dealing with stuff across repositories? Because one of the things that I kind of heard today that stuck with me was saying, I like a monorepo because I can kind of, find all of our code, in one place, or I can find all instances of stuff. I know where it is. Do we lack tools to take a set of repositories which are not tightly coupled, but, well related, loosely coupled? Do we kind of lack good tools for that sort of scenario that would make a monorepo less attractive?
We're working on this at the moment. We have this problem with how we have our repository structured. GitLab's got a monolithic Rails application, which is the web application, and then a range of other components like Gitly and some other services. And each being a separate repository, every release we kind of have to bundle them up. And changes often touch multiple components in the system. So we have this problem where we're trying to build a way of coordinating those merge requests so that you can signal to someone who's reviewing one component, maybe don't merge this just yet. There's something else that needs to merge first. And making that more automated so that some of those pains of not having a monolithic project can be ameliorated.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, we are lacking good tools, and that might be a good step in that direction. But I think we can do better, though, right? Like having everything in a monorepo checked out makes things like, if I'm going to refactor this, the function of a library that's shared across different parts of this large distributed system, it's pretty easy, relatively speaking, because I can use code smarts and things to find usages across all these projects, and maybe even do a single refactor across all these things that are technically separate libraries. You can't do that if you split everything out sort of traditionally in small repos. But there's no reason fundamentally that we couldn't make that work, though, right? If we had and I mean, these tools exist, it's just that we don't really support any of that yet. But if a code host had enough smarts and understood that it's not just a bunch of text files in your repository, but it's code and it's Java or C# or whatever, and I understand this and I can compile this, and therefore I can find trace imports and I can see that there's a Maven file here, and that means that there's libraries that depend on that are over there, maybe even on GitHub. I can crawl those things as well, and you can build a huge, large index, an actual code index, and at that point, like I think it's possible to make like that scenario a lot better, right? Where like I am going to refactor this thing, who is it going to impact? And it's not just a matter of sort of knowing that this library is used there, so you'll probably talk to the maintainer of this other thing. No, like in principle, I should be able to like get a really good educated guess as to these are all the things that need to change. But yeah, that doesn't exist today, or at least we don't do it. Like there's all kinds of stuff out there, but yeah.
Cool.
I think that also sort of touches on the fact that there can be lots of tools that sort of enable all these individual capabilities and streamline specific problems, but unless they're kind of integrated into the main tool that developers come into to do their programming, to do their code reviews and merge requests, they often just get forgotten or not used. Like they're not as effective if you have to go to 3 different places to make sure I haven't forgotten about this thing. So making sure all these systems and tools integrate into a single place, single source of truth is really important.
Yeah, and I find, this is just kind of personal aside story, it's kind of like, I find that I fully trust Git grep to find all instances of a local repository I have here. Any sort of code search that's been kind of like indexed, and I know there's kind of like magic indexes behind the scene, you always kind of think, is it up to date? Is it working? Has it found everything? so yeah, we've got to kind of build the ability to trust our tools. And that kind of
it depends a bit on the language, I suppose, right? Like a dynamic language, that kind of stuff is really hard. Like Java, C# or like a release-only type language. Those tools, I tend to trust them pretty well, but yeah, it pretty much depends on like how much dynamic stuff you've got going on.
Cool. So I'm going to change tack a little bit and talk about kind of like users learning and training. So it's kind of like open source projects tend to kind of use tools that are kind of chosen by the maintainer and the kind of core developers, and it's kind of in enterprises a lot of times kind of tools are mandated. Is Git accessible enough to the average developer or even designer or somebody else who needs to make changes? Can we make it easier? Should we make it easier?
I could talk about this all day. I think, yes, Git is accessible. That does not mean it's easy. I think one of my favorite things during a Git and GitHub training is helping somebody who really does not think they can learn Git and also really just doesn't want to. Much like the design speech earlier, like going through a few things and actually doing it and seeing, okay, this is clicking. Even if I don't necessarily understand the big picture yet, just enough to do something that I can be successful. It's a horrible feeling to already be in your career, established at a large company, and then have to learn something that, at least when I learned Git, it just made me feel like such an idiot. Like that sucks. Nobody likes that. But having trained so many people, it's also, I think, a great opportunity for them to have that light bulb moment again and hopefully become excited about it. That being said, I definitely think we can always be improving how we teach it and how we help people use it.
Yeah, and I agree. Like we at Atlassian, we from the moment we switched to a distributed version control system, we initially went to Mercurial because 10 years ago, I think the bets were out still, and Mercurial, at least we thought, was easier to onboard from coming from a Subversion background. The commands are a bit more like it, but underneath it's very technically it's very similar to Git, and so it had most of the advantages. And we have sort of an onboarding thing where like new people, whether they're fresh out of college or just experienced developers that come from another company, go through a boot camp type thingy, which includes comprehensive. Here's how to use Mercurial or Git these days. So yeah, I think it's pretty important.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work that has happened over the past years to improve some of the commands of Git to make them more easy, and there's some proposals, I think, out there to streamline some of the common commands in favor of some new ones. So I think that's really exciting to see that the core Git project is working to make the command line tool easier to use, but I think there also is a big market of all these desktop clients. I think you have the GitHub desktop and the Atlassian source tree, and there's Tower and a whole bunch of other great vendors out there building these amazing visual tools to help people not only use Git successfully, but also expose more of like the underlying capabilities. I think it's very hard for a new user to often get their head around rewriting history, and that's one of the most powerful things that you can do on a Git branch. I know that some organizations don't like that, and you never want to do it on a master branch, for example, but don't make that mistake. But exposing that to new users and helping them feel powerful and feel successful using Git, I think, is a really great thing, because it's not just about Git add, Git commit, Git push. Like there's a whole lot more that you can be doing, and having a local history and being able to just search it and interact with it freely is one of the big selling points of distributed version control, and one of the reasons why it's been so successful.
Yeah, I certainly enjoy the power of it, but I guess backwards compatibility is the spectre in the room, because all of the Git commands that people are very experienced with it, are familiar with, they don't want them to change suddenly under them. So and it's so flexible. So I guess the question that I least like to answer from somebody who's asking for help is, well, what does Git push without arguments do? And it's kind of like, well, that depends, doesn't it? So I mean, yeah. Is backwards compatibility and flexibility kind of, does that mean that we should be, how do we solve that? Oh, gosh.
I just need a big hat that says it depends on it, right?
Yeah.
And every time I'm doing a training and any question, it's like, well, it just depends on like a bunch of things that you really don't care about. But that's hard. I don't know the answer to that one.
Yeah, I don't think there are any easy solutions to that.
I will say, actually, I think something in training, as Git enthusiasts, has taken me time, and I still struggle with not telling them too much. I can be so excited. I can give them the long answer, and I really want to, and knowing when that's just not right for them at that moment. What do they need to hear to move their understanding along meaningfully, and keeping my own excitement tamped down enough to do that is hard, maybe something people here can relate with, and I think really important when you're helping new users with Git.
That's interesting. I think we see quite a bit of use cases, support cases, where I think people that are not sort of Git experts or gurus or even that interested in it end up doing really complicated things or sophisticated things like rebasing and all these things when it's clear that they really understand what they're doing. And that can be a very dangerous thing. Yeah. And so, I wonder how that happens. As you said, I have to be careful not to overshare or give them too much information right away. I think that's really important, right? You can be effective, and I think a lot of sort of average or whatever engineers, developers that just use these tools to get their work done, they can get by very far without knowing how to rebase and how to reset and do all these kind of things. Yes, sometimes it's necessary, but I don't think it's necessary to immediately understand all of that kind of stuff. And in fact, it might be better to maybe not immediately jump on that. And so I feel that maybe sometimes new engineers sort of get handed this sheet of these are the things you need to do, and you always need to rebase, and you need to force push. I don't know what that is. I'll just do it. Oh, it seems to work. That's a dangerous thing, and that comes back in support cases because that blows up sometimes. Then you have no idea what to do. So, again, I think there's a responsibility for us. I mean, that's you're a trainer, you do that stuff all the time. But for our products to guide people towards a sensible workflow that we know is a good place to start, and not overload them with all these things that it could do.
And sensible defaults, so that if someone does try to force push to master, by default that's rejected, because that is a objectively wrong thing to do most of the time. So we can protect our users from mistakes that are easy to make when copying and pasting from Stack Overflow.
Cool. So I guess we'll probably have to kind of wrap up fairly rapidly. Any kind of last tips, guides, or stories you want to kind of share with people for surviving Git in the enterprise?
Surviving Git in the enterprise. That's a big one. I guess if you're ever, I think in the enterprise, there's an assumption that people may already know stuff that they don't know. And there's people maybe not ask questions even though they have them. So whenever you're interacting with someone, in my experience, just don't assume that they know something. You don't need to be insulting and talk down to them, but it's also okay. I'm like the first person to say I don't know everything about Git, and I think enterprise users are no exception to that either.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think there's space to also encourage best practices, like not just with training, but also our tools can sort of like hint and nudge users and reward them for being successful in doing things that are really great. Like, I don't know, using long commit messages and things like that. A lot of people forget that they're going to have to come back to those commit messages, not just a week later, but their colleague 4 years from now that they've never met is going to be reading those when there's a production outage and want to understand what was going on. And so I think tools like GitLab and Bitbucket and GitHub, we can reward users that do those right things and streamline those workflows and sort of, not gamify, like that can be quite annoying, but just magnify the benefits of best practices so that even someone who just stumbles into GitLab and does something well, like it just makes their life easier.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, James, Briana, Erik. I hope you've enjoyed this panel, and I'm sure you'll be able to kind of grab any of us afterwards if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you, CB.
Thank you.